All right, good morning, everybody. So somehow we are at the end of the year and the last talk of the year and the last talk about Nyoho, and maybe there's rejoicing in the streets at this point after 12 months. So this seems like an appropriate place to take up one of the major threads of Nyoho practice, which is this connection to the past and to tradition. We've seen that all year. That's an important theme, an important thread of Nyoho practice. And yet, we are also told that it's equally important to really pay attention to this moment, here and now, and this moment is the only moment in which we can act, and we get to carry these two threads, these two things. So sometimes this looks to us like an intersection of past and future, and now, big capital now, is in the middle. Right? Somehow that eternal now is right in the middle. It's at the center of the intersection. Sometimes it looks like a pendulum. There's past and there's future. Or it looks like a spiral. We've been here before. It looks slightly different, but here it is again. Right? So just in our human brains, we have several images, I think, that we use to think about this and to talk about this. Things move in one direction. They move back the other way. What direction are they going? So we've just put up the last 4 chapters of Echukuma's book, Study of the Okesa, online. So if you've been following along, you know that there's a translation happening. Yuko and Ko and Franz have been working on a translation of this very important book, which we've been putting up online and connecting to the Sawaki Nyoho Treasury. Go out to Sanshin Source. You can see that for free. In chapter 11, which is about how to wear the Okesa, Echukuma says, you have to wear this Okesa pragmatically. And I think that's a really interesting phrase. To be pragmatic is to be practical, right? To be realistic, focusing on what's happening in the real world right now, wherever we are. It's great to have theories and ideas. Those things are helpful. Those things are inspiring. There's nothing wrong with theories and ideas. But he says we have to wear the robe pragmatically. And of course, he's not just talking about Okesa, he's talking about Rakusu, right? And even if you don't have a physical robe, right? You're wearing something because you're a practitioner. So that might seem surprising because Rakusu and Okesa are not everyday garments in 21st century America. It's a little strange to think about this thing, right? Wearing this thing pragmatically. But he says, if it becomes a costume, then one starts imagining ways of adorning it or wearing it differently. But because the kesa is ultimately a practical garment, it must be worn as such, right? My goodness, 21st century North America, we like to make everything over in our own way. So that's a really interesting teaching. If the Rakusu or Okesa becomes a costume, then it's subject to our stories about it, our feelings about it, our ideas about it, right? Well, this is a thing that I wear in the Zendo when I'm pretending to be enlightened, or I'm pretending to be Buddhist, or I'm pretending to be a monk, or something, right? We put these things on, and suddenly there's this whole idea, this whole story thing happening. Then we can think, well, it doesn't matter if I make it any way I want, or wear it any way I want, because this has something to do with expressing myself, right? Expressing my aspiration or my understanding or something, and it very much becomes about small self. So as soon as we have an idea about the robe, it becomes a costume. I think that's a really interesting teaching. As soon as we separate the robe from the practicality, from the pragmatism, from this moment, then it's just a story that we're telling ourselves, right? There is historical development to this. There's a reason this looks like this. It didn't have to be this way, but causes and conditions, right? It developed like this. So there are a number of places in his book where Echukuma describes how things were originally, maybe in India or in China, because of course he's Japanese and he's writing from a Japanese point of view. So then he shows how these things have been appropriately adapted for 20th century Japan. Nyoho doesn't ask us to get stuck in the past. And I think that's something we have to be careful about. That's a pitfall we can fall into. Oh, Nyoho is all about connecting to history, connecting to the past, connecting to the ancestors. Yes, and Nyoho doesn't ask us to get stuck there. It does ask us to look at here and now. So somehow we have to hold and carry both the ancient wisdom of this tradition, which is important for us, and the causes and conditions of this moment. What's in that intersection? So that means there's plenty of room there for the realities of modern life, right? For fires and floods in Los Angeles, for government layoffs, for Hollywood murders, for an American pope, for whatever is going on this year. 2025 had it all, right? As every year does. I think every year at the end of the year we say, wow, this year, man, this year had it all. Sometimes modernity can feel scary. Every new thing that appears on the horizon has this potential for destabilizing us. Here's this new thing that we didn't expect, or that somehow came out of we don't know where. We can slip into the idea that, well, in the past, well, everything was great. And that's not just talking to grandma and grandpa, right? Back in the day, I love the little magnet that says, eat organic food, or as your grandparents called it, food, right? It's like we want to throw back and say, oh, that was the day. Those were the days. That was the time. Everything was good. Everything was great. Things were simpler. Things were healthier, more natural, more honest, kinder, wiser, right? Less distracting. Somehow in the past, everything was great. Everybody knew what was what, and we've wandered away. If only we could get back there. If only we could recreate those conditions, our modern problems would go away, everything would be fine, if we could just get back to the days before smartphones and computers and cars and whatever. So that fixation on the past can keep us from creating a meaningful future, right? The reality is that AI and fast fashion and cryptocurrency are not going away. So at the same time that all of that is happening, we're listening to and studying and practicing with 2,600-year-old teachings from Shakyamuni and 800-year-old teachings from Dogen and 100-year-old teachings from Sawaki Roshi and trying to live in their way. And how the heck do we do that? So somehow we have to figure out how to stand up squarely in this intersection of Nyoho and 21st century North America. Because Nyoho is relevant to us. We just need to see how that happens. So how do we carry this long-standing traditional wisdom and still respond to the world on fire right now? Maybe we don't think it's on fire, but the world right now. So how can knowing something about this attitude of Nyoho help us to navigate the world as we move into 2026 and beyond that? Because the world today surely contains more than food, clothing, and shelter, as is true of any time in our history. Even when, 800, 1,000 years ago, or wherever we started talking about this, surely there was more going on than food, clothing, and shelter. We know that. One of the characteristics of this tendency to cling to an idealized past, according to a historian named Tim Snyder, is the belief that the reason things are worse today than they used to be is that somebody came along, some outside force came along, and took from us the things that made that time so good. It's not our fault. Someone else did this to us. We couldn't help it, right? So it may certainly be true that there was an invading army, or there was an epidemic, or there was a famine, or an unprovoked attack, or something, right? Something we couldn't control. But if we respond simply by pointing to something out there, or even worse, those people, they did it all, then we give up our agency, right? Then we decide we don't have a choice about how to respond. None of this is our fault, but we also don't have any control, so there's nothing we can do. So if we do that, then we don't take those necessary steps to figure out a meaningful future, a healthy, wholesome, meaningful future. And we don't think about fixing the mistakes, maybe, that we're making now so those bad things don't happen again. So this should sound familiar to us, right, as children of Buddha. This is, the basic ideas that this idea that suffering comes from outside, that we're powerless to do anything about it. This is basic delusion, right, about the nature of suffering. This is not the way suffering actually works. So now this year we've seen that Nyoho is in the little things. It's in the littlest things. Nyoho is not asking us to make grand gestures. It's simply sitting there on our shoulders all the time, whispering, what? Does this thing create attachment? So that's a wisdom question that we can work with moment by moment by moment all the time, no matter where we are, no matter what's happening, what year it is. Nyoho is sitting here on his shoulders saying, does this thing create attachment? So I've always been particularly fond of one of Dogen's poems called Yearning for the Ancient Way. That's the English name of this poem. Probably you've heard this poem. The way of the patriarchs, coming from the west, I transmit to the east. Yearning for the ancient ways, catching the moon, cultivating the clouds, untouched by worldly dust fluttering about, a thatched hut, snowy evening, deep mountain. So the patriarch coming from the west was, of course, Bodhidharma, coming from India to China. So this is the way of Bodhidharma, coming from India to China. Dogen went to China to learn about Zen, and then he brought what he learned back to Japan, particularly in two ways, or two things, as we know. One is the Dharma he learned from his teacher, Tendo Nyoho. The other is the monastic container, because he thought that was the way the Dharma was going to be preserved and transmitted. So it's like, here's the teachings, and then here's the container for the teachings. And those two things he thought were particularly important. So yearning for the ancient ways was some reflection of his feeling that those around him in Japan at that time didn't really understand the practice, and we know that from his writings. Somehow, people didn't understand. So this is why he went backward along the trail, if you will, to China, to try to pick up the thread, try to find some authentic teachings. Catching the moon is seeing unity, or non-separation, right? Finger pointing at the moon. Cultivating the clouds, on the other hand, is working with the everyday things we encounter. So we have form and emptiness, right? We have small self and universal self. Untouched by worldly dust is to see things as they really are before our discriminating minds kick in and start having opinions and ideas and writing stories. And then there's just the thatched hut on a snowy evening deep in the mountains. So the reality of this moment with nothing extra. The way of the patriarchs coming from the west, I transmit to the east. Yearning for the ancient ways, catching the moon, cultivating the clouds, untouched by worldly dust fluttering about a thatched hut, snowy evening, deep mountain. So it seems to me the continuing references to reality are important here. Coming after his saying that what he's carrying forward are ancient teachings, starting all the way back with Bodhidharma. He says, I'm carrying these things forward. And yet, we can't actually carry forward ancient teachings about reality, because that's what it is, without seeing those things for ourselves in this moment, seeing them for what they are, seeing this moment for what it is. Otherwise, what we're carrying, I would say, is historically based fiction. We have some idea about what Dogen's life was like, or what Buddha's life was like, or how people used to practice, or how they practiced somewhere else. There's some mythical golden time we've conjured up for ourselves, right? Practice was great back here. Times were great over there, right? So what's unpretentious and unassuming, which are, of course, the important things about Nyoho. Things are unpretentious, things are unassuming. What's unpretentious and unassuming in Kamakura, Japan, is not what is unpretentious and unassuming now, right? Things that were common that Dogen ran into every day, today would be exotic. Using what exists on hand, another important part of Nyoho. Doing that in 21st century North America is not using what existed on hand when folks were coming up with the Vinaya and writing the rules, right? Circumstances were different, causes and conditions were different. So when Echukuma writes about washing the Rakusu, or washing the Yokesa, which, yes, from time to time, we spill soup on the Rakusu. It's time to wash it. So he says, Dogen Zenji, in Shobogenzo Keisakudoku, did write in detail about how to properly wash the kesa. According to those instructions, people of old used to wash using hot water with ash. Today, because we can, it's better to select detergent appropriate to a particular fabric and use that. That said, it's necessary to remind ourselves that the kesa ultimately is the Buddha body. It's the Buddha's mind. As such, we must treat it with reverence. Never treat the kesa as you would your kimono or other laundry. Prepare a purely clean wash basin and drying rod, then wash the kesa, taking care not to harm it in any way. So today we don't need to wash things in ash water, right? Times have changed since the Vinaya. That's what they did then, and we could sort of make that a holy relic. But here's a very well-known teacher about Okesa saying, don't do that. Find an appropriate detergent. You don't need to do the ash water, right? We also don't just toss these robes in the washing machine. Although I did hear tell, I won't say who, of someone tossing his Okay, so into the washing machine along with his laundry. Yee! Yeah, so we don't do that. We don't just sort of treat that like laundry. There is a ritual washing process that we go through. On the one hand, this is simply a piece of fabric, and on the other hand, this is Buddha's body and mind, right? So there's a sort of a middle ground, I think, between the really formalized food, clothing, shelter of Nyoho and the elements of Japanese culture which you might be familiar with called do or ways. There are a lot of ways, right? Kendo, the way of the sword. Shoto, the way of calligraphy. Kado, the way of flowers. Koto, the way of incense. You've heard of these ways. There are many, many ways. So you can engage with these things in an everyday way for purely utilitarian purposes. You need to write something, right? You need to defend yourself. But you could also make a real practice of encountering them, using them very intentionally, right? Taking some real care. So there's a whole practice around most of these things. We could just make a flower arrangement out of, something, or we could be thoughtful about that. So here Doju and Sawyer and I were just having a conversation the other day. I've asked the two of them to identify the things in the yard we can offer to Buddha, the things we can safely cut without harming the plant or ourselves, right? That we can offer to Buddha, which means we don't go to the store or the flower shop and buy the expensive lilies, right? So how do we manage that? We can do that with some intention. So the system of do or ways is somewhat different from this orientation toward Nyoho. There's a little bit of overlap, but these ways centralize things like the teacher-student relationship and learning through repetition, and it's got some very specific objectives. It's trying to do a particular thing. What these two do have in common, I think, is this attitude of selflessness, putting aside small self for a while. If you're learning Kyudo, which is the way of the bow, you respect and obey your teacher. This is not uncommon across these ways. You do the same practice activity over and over and over and over, and you pay attention. So all of this is also an exercise in setting aside this sort of grasping, judging, clinging self. So the point is to take skillful action without the kind of discursive thinking that we do with the small self that needs to preserve its ego. Am I going to get this right? Am I going to be embarrassed? Right? There's all this stuff that happens, right? How do we just take skillful action without this discursive mind sort of getting in the middle, getting in the way? How do we see and accept the reality of the moment and then do what needs to be done without stop and get caught up in the three poisons and various delusions and stories and all of that, right? So it's not enough just to learn the forms. You can do the repetition and just learn the forms, but that's not enough. Somehow, we also need to understand the attitude. So we could sew robes over and over and over again and not understand the attitude. Or we could make a meal, go through the repetition of that exercise over and over and over and not understand the attitude. So it's important, this selflessness piece, right, is really important. If you're learning to be a no theater actor or do the tea ceremony or play traditional Japanese sports in some way, yes, you have to learn the basic movements, but you also have to acquire the attitude. And I think this is one of the ways that we bring Nyoho into the rest of our lives, beyond food, clothing, and shelter. So there is some overlap in the characteristics that we cultivate in these traditional ways and the words that we use to describe Nyoho things. Being harmonious within the environment, right? So not sticking out, not drawing attention, not being a distraction, being an obstacle to people. Purity, not containing or displaying anything extra. To me, purity is not about good and bad and defiled and not, it's about there's nothing extra. We've distilled something down to the essence and there's nothing extra. Respect, okay, not cutting off roots of the tradition or the teachings that we've received from elders, teachers, brothers and sisters. Stillness and tranquility, of course, helping us to focus and concentrate on the reality of this thing and this moment and probably ourselves. How about the reality of this? That's a project in itself, right? So at the beginning of the year, we heard Ko and Franz refer to Nyoho as an adaptable aesthetic philosophy. And this was his own phrase. He took credit for that. An adaptable aesthetic philosophy. So again, there's some overlap with these traditional Japanese aesthetics. It is not completely congruent, but there's a bit of overlap. There's something we can learn. So you've probably heard of wabi-sabi, right? Finding beauty in the imperfect, the impermanent, right? The incomplete. Rustic things, things that show their age, things that show their wear. We don't just toss them aside. Can we appreciate them and continue to use them. Then there's yugen. So if you've studied Japanese literature at all, you've run into yugen, which is a deep, mysterious sense of beauty and subtlety. At least that's where I encountered it. You may encounter it elsewhere. So this is about being aware of more than what we can immediately see, being aware of more than what's immediately visible. There's something else, deep, profound, something else is happening there, right? So we have form and also emptiness. The things we can see and the things we can't see, the individual and the universal, all right there. How about kanso? Kanso is simplicity that's achieved through elimination. And again, we're back to nothing extra, right? Stripping away the non-essential. And we can think about this as, here's all the stuff we layer on top of our perceptions, our ideas, our predilections, our likes and dislikes. Can we pull all that back? And again, nothing extra, right? Shizen is naturalness, spontaneity, freedom from pretense, freedom from I need to be something other than I am, or I need to make this thing into something other than it is. All of those things return us to this question: does this thing create attachment? Right? So we have many, many, many gateways into these teachings. One interesting aspect of functioning within these ways is the theme, and this is my paraphrase, that cultivating the inside is reflected in the manifestation on the outside, and vice versa. Right? Cultivating the inside is reflected going out, and what we cultivate outwardly changes us on the inside. So improving our character improves the way we move through the world. And improving our deportment and our ability to take skillful action also helps our character, helps our understanding. These things are not separate. So I've heard this referred to as fake it till you make it, but I don't like that. I don't think it's fake. I think there's aspiration. I think our practice is incomplete because as bodhisattvas, our practice is always incomplete. But we can consider what's going on in here, what's going on out here. They are reflecting each other. So clearly this goes beyond dealing with food, clothing, and shelter specifically, right? Though paying attention to how we eat food, how we wear clothes, the shelter that we're in, that's an important practice for us. We have to remember those things were prioritized, food, clothing, and shelter, because that's the three things that monks were supposed to need. We're not living that way, most of us here. We have households. We don't live in the temple. Most of us aren't training that way. And yet, we can take Nyoho into the rest of our lives. So how about paying attention to how we use garden tools, or phones, or tablets, or computers? What about cars and motorcycles and the luggage cart you rent at the airport, right? We've got a million opportunities. How about the credit card, the travel mug, the yoga mat, whatever we're encountering? How are we using those things? How are we interacting with them? How do we see them? What do we think our relationship is? Who do those things make us? Does this thing create attachment? So we can see that this is really a practical approach to life, even though we might study it most intensively when we're in an environment that feels a bit exotic, like we're eating using oryoki during sesshin. Or we're looking around the zendo and there's a lot of people in robes, sometimes fancy robes depending on the occasion. So making a robe, moving around the zendo. Might feel like that's when Nyoho really is right in front of us. So as I say, Nyoho focuses on food, clothing, and shelter because these are the things monks were supposed to need. Today, I think as householders in 21st century America, we have an opportunity to expand, develop those teachings in some interesting, new, different ways. Not twisting the spirit of it, but how do we apply that to our lives, which don't look like monks in a training temple, right? I think there's lots of opportunity there. So, we're faced with developments that the writers of the Vinaya, and probably even Sawaki Roshi, could never imagine. We have opportunities to work with Nyoho in ways that our ancestors never could have dreamed up. So how can we consider the teachings of Nyoho as a basis for tackling the biggest issues we face today? There's an interesting exercise. How about economic issues like cost of living, health care, job security? These are very real issues for us. And you would think, well, Nyoho's over here, and the news is over there. And I would say there are intersections there. We may be foregoing purchases we'd like to be making these days. Maybe these are things we would have comfortably bought in the past, and our circumstances have changed a bit. Maybe we're making do with things a bit longer. Maybe we're reusing what we have. Maybe we're buying the less expensive thing. Certainly, Nyoho teachings have plenty to say about choosing the unassuming thing, the unpretentious thing, the appropriate thing, rather than the flashy new thing for the sake of having a flashy new thing. So that doesn't mean we choose an ascetic life in order to be somebody. Am I not a wonderfully advanced practitioner because I'm living in a very humble way? That's my idea about Nyoho, right? We still need to take care of ourselves. We still need to take care of our families as best as we can under these circumstances. But we can think carefully about where are our resources going, right? If you're remodeling your house, this year I've had a lot of experience with house. If you're remodeling your house, sometimes a lot of money has to go to the infrastructure that nobody ever sees, right? You got to fix the plumbing. You got to put in a new water heater. You'd rather be spending money on the beautiful fixtures and finishes, and yet, thousands of dollars are going into the things that are going to hold up the house. What a disappointment, right? And yet, that's the appropriate thing that you need to do. So it might be that our practice during this time is simply to live more modestly without having any ideas about that, about who we are. Am I not a wonderfully humble person? And potentially also, in addition to just sort of being virtuous, we're being virtuous by managing our spending. Another idea we can fall into is that this is all the fault of those people out there, and that's how greed and anger, that's how anger and hatred arise, how separation gets created because we have some ideas about how things should be. This isn't fair. It might not be fair. And how helpful is it to ruminate on that? So that's not to say that the skillful thing might not be to speak up, right? To take some action, become engaged in the community. These teachings are not saying, go in a hole and pull it in after you. How do we do that from a strong foundation of wisdom and compassion and equanimity rather than indignation, right, and revenge? That's a challenge. So when we feel like things are out of our own control, what happens? We get scared. We don't like to admit that, right? We like to be in control. When we feel like things are not in our control, we are fearful. The basis of anger is fear. So whenever we're facing some conflict, it can be helpful to look at the fear that's at the bottom of that. There's probably somebody somewhere who's scared. How can we look at that and realize how separation is being created? And then how do we keep from creating that separation? Or in Sawaki Roshi's image, how do we cover the canal with the kesa? Right? Fear and conflict are based on attachment. Nyoho asks us to be aware of attachment and clinging. And so there we go. We have some opportunities for practice. So it may certainly be true that despite our best efforts to be economically responsible, we can't pay our bills. We've lost our jobs. Those are real circumstances that we're in. We need to face them squarely. We can't look away from that, pretend it doesn't exist. And we do have some control over how we respond and whether we do that skillfully or whether we engage the three poisons. Where are the attachments? How do we navigate that? Maybe we're on the other side of this issue. We have enough resources somehow that we're in a position to share. We can do some giving of some kind. We can do that in a showy way that makes us very important. Am I not a wonderful savior? I'm coming over the hill, right? Going to save everybody. Or we can do that quietly. We can do that in ways that are really needed, making choices about giving based on the real circumstances of this moment and offering what's actually helpful and not just what we want to offer in the way that we want to offer it. Okay, how about issues of governance, political issues and issues of governance? Interesting, right? Corruption, poor leadership, polarization. We look at these things every day. Well, we've gone from anger to greed, right? All of this is about self-clinging. It's the very opposite of Nyoho. Corruption is the abuse of power that's been given in trust in order to get something for yourself. This is very much about clinging, right? Buddha had some things to say about good leadership and how to do governance. We think governance is a modern thing. We only think about this now, right? Buddha had plenty to say. How do you be a good ruler? How do you do good governance? So there's a place where he lists 10 characteristics of a good ruler. And these are things like generosity, morality, honesty, self-control, nonviolence. I won't read you the whole list, but you can imagine, right? So These things all make leaders trustworthy. Even though leaders are going to make mistakes as fallible human beings. And that's everything from a board of directors all the way up, right? Leadership is every place. We are leaders because we're bodhisattvas. If you're interested in bodhisattva leadership, please go out to Sanshin Source. I've got a whole section out there, right? Leadership is a fascinating practice. And there's Nyoho in there because there's so much in there which is about setting aside small self and yet still being very present to the needs of the people that you're serving. So there's a really interesting intersection there. Anyway, I think if as leaders we can pay attention to these 10 characteristics that Buddha's listing that make us trustworthy as leaders, we're going to make mistakes because we're fallible human beings, but it means we can acknowledge attachment, we can acknowledge the roots of suffering, make changes that we need to make without breaking trust. So finally, what about Nyoho and social issues like housing, immigration policy, social security, right? We hear these things all the time. Nyoho certainly has things to say about shelter in terms of physical space. We've seen that, right? There's a larger teaching here too, I think, about harmony and harmony within a community. And you would think, well, that's a strange bedfellows, right? But I think Nyoho has some things to say about harmony within a community. How are we with each other in a larger space that may not actually be defined by physical boundaries? How much space are we taking up that is not necessarily about the footprint of my room? So the last of Buddha's 10 characteristics of a good ruler is uprightness in this translation. Uprightness, meaning respecting the opinions and the input of others, and using that process to promote harmony and prevent what Dogen would have called disorder in the way, right? If you're here for Rakafsatsu, you hear about disorder in the way. How are we going to prevent disorder in the way? How much space are we taking up? So, excuse me, harmony is about things or people coming together well, functioning well together, functioning together in ways that don't create unwholesome attachment, don't arouse the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. So when we look at some of the characteristics, I mean, way back to the beginning, broken color. We've talked about things that are made by Nyoho are a broken color, right? Broken color is a harmony of 2 shades, like black and blue or black and brown, right? These 2 things are coexisting. Interesting, right? For a Nyoho meal, we're careful to include all 5 colors and 6 tastes. These things all in the interest of harmony, right? And it's harmony of color and harmony of flavor and harmony of nutrition. How do these things come together? So there's this really interesting, I think, underlying theme in Nyoho about harmony. How do things come together and function together well? Harmony points to inclusion, points to non-separation. That means people, including people, also including points of view, taking various positions into account. So it doesn't mean everyone in society gets everything they want all the time. We know that's not possible. But can people at least feel heard? Will there be disagreement? Yes. Can we handle that in a mature, wholesome way? I hope so. So, we can do that without breaking harmony, without breaking trust. One of the things we've considered about Nyoho is the teaching that there is only this one thing. There is this one cup or this one room or this one robe, right? It's a manifestation of Indra's net, this interconnectedness of all things. So although we might see ourselves as members of a particular group or class or religion or community or culture, ethnicity, there is also just this one community. Who falls outside of Buddha's way? You can't point to anybody who's outside of Buddha's way. We can also, we can always look beyond the particulars. So that's not, negotiating them or ignoring them. I'm sorry, not negating them or ignoring them, but seeing that it's not the whole story. I'm not you, you're not me, I can't eat for you, you like things I don't like, you have skills I don't have. Fantastic, right? That's the spice of life. We don't all need to be the same. And also we know there's something underlying that says there's nobody outside of Buddha's way. There is only one community. So if we can do that, look beyond the particulars, see that it's not the whole story, we can find some common ground with the next person, the next neighborhood, the next special interest group, whatever that means for us in that moment. We can see that because we're connected, When these folks suffer, we also suffer. When these folks have well-being, we also have well-being. This is basic stuff, right? And I think Nyoho is pointing us back to it in a really interesting way. So Nyoho teachings are great at getting us to step back from small self, step back from the self-involvement, to notice that there is an unassuming path. There is a way to move through the world, setting aside small self, not negating it, not punishing it, not ignoring it, just getting it out of the way, letting it step out of the way. There's an unassuming path, and there are good reasons to take the unassuming path, right? It seems to go against popular sentiment, which says the louder and flashier you are, the more you go after your 15 minutes of fame, somehow the more successful you are. It seems to go against that a little bit. So my very sincere hope is that although now, at the end of this year, we're shifting into 2026, we're going to shift our focus into the world of Soto Zen. My hope is that this conversation about Nyoho is not over, right? I hope that this is now part of our practice life at Sanjin. It's always been part of our practice life because we've inherited this from Sawaki Roshi. But I hope now we understand it a bit more fully and we can apply it in many interesting ways. So I really hope this conversation is not over. Nyoho resources are going to remain on Sanshin Source. Please review those at any time or look at the pages you haven't had a chance to read yet. There's a big section out there now. I'm happy to say we're also going to have an e-book coming out, I hope shortly. I'm just finishing it up in the next day or two and getting that off to the Dogen Institute. It's going to summarize all the teachings of the year. I'm thrilled with it, I got to say. I wish I'd had this resource when I was coming up, when I was starting. It's close to 200 pages, right? We've covered a lot of ground this year. So please look for that. That's coming. Okay, let's continue to consider materials, color, and amount in oh so many ways, right? Let's continue to move toward the unassuming, the unpretentious, the things that let us set aside small self. Since materials also means form or body, as we've seen, let's continue to refine our deportment with intention and attention. Doesn't mean to become rigid and inflexible. It means pay attention to what am I doing with this body and mind. If we get some correction about a form, if we add something new, let's pay attention to that without resentment, without ideas. What are we doing with this body and mind? Can we pay attention to our deportment? Since color also means tone and atmosphere, as we've seen, let's pay attention to the way we treat each other and the feeling that we're creating in the Zendo, in the temple, and also outside of here. That's also color, because that's tone and atmosphere and feeling, right? Since amount also means size and capacity, let's consider our footprint. How much space are we taking up, literally and figuratively, right? How many resources are we using? Are we using more than we need? Are we taking up more space than we need? So, I thank you for your practice this year. I look forward to another meaningful year of practice in 2026 when we start to learn some more about the world of Soto Zen. Please let's not leave Nyoho behind. All right, what would you all like to say about Nyoho, how we apply it, how we encounter it, or things about the year? Let's start with folks in here. We'll move to folks online. Comments, questions, reflections? Jeff?
Just a comment back to the beginning of your talk today, which was wonderful, by the way. When you were talking about the pragmatics of robes today, one dimension that you didn't touch that came up for me, I experienced first in one of, I think it was one of Tornin's groups during the year, and it was a priest colleague of yours who doesn't wear robes. Mm. And I learned just a little bit about it. I mentioned it to you at the time. You knew her story and her very well. But that, for me, I was wondering about how you include that rational non-separation of the robe person from other people.
So one of the interesting things as this practice moves into 21st century North America is how we understand the robe and what we think it represents. And we are not the first ones to encounter these questions because When we look at Catholic practice, for instance, and the nuns wearing habits, and some of them wear habits and some of them don't, and these are real questions about when we wear a robe, what does it mean for our practice, and what is it representing out here? I'm not here to tell anybody how to practice or represent their tradition. What I can say is that within Soto Zen, and those of us that are affiliated formally with the denomination, there are regulations about vestments. We are told this is what we wear. So if we choose to take this path and affiliate with the denomination and be recognized and all of that, interestingly, one of the things I'm learning as the board chair of Soto Zen North America, I see that relationship differently now between the clergy and the denomination with regard to this, because it didn't occur to me until sometime this year. When we are authorized by the denomination to teach and to be clergy and to function in this way, what we're also being authorized to do is to represent the denomination. We are not in this for ourselves, right? So when I put this stuff on, I'm representing my teacher, I'm representing my lineage, I'm representing Buddha, but I'm also representing the denomination, and there are regulations about that, and I agree to follow them because I'm part of this thing, right? If you're not part of the denomination, you get to make choices. And people do, and they should. So there's a couple of schools of, there's more than one school of thought, but one school of thought is, if I wear these things, I'm creating separation because I look different than my Sangha. And maybe I'm scary, and maybe I have some ego around that, and maybe it's all just exotic, ancient stuff that gets in the way, and that could be a completely legitimate argument. And I would never tell somebody they shouldn't practice like that, right? For me, this means the opposite. For me, this means open for business. This means if I'm wearing this, I'm here to help you. I'm sure maybe it's happened to others here who are practice leaders. If I'm traveling to Japan and I get on a plane, I don't wear this, but I wear something that looks a bit like clearly somebody's about religious, right? And it rocks it. And I can't tell you how many people in the seat next to me on the plane started spilling, right? Open for business. So there's something about that. So I think each of us as clergy gets to negotiate that. And that's why, for instance, if I ordain somebody and put a robe on his or her back, it's a long time before I ask that person to start taking some kinds of responsibility, because I think we need to figure that out, right? Like, it's not just I'm wearing a scarf. There's something about carrying this that I need to figure out. I need to do that in a way which is not about my ego, right? But I need to get my feet under me before I can start, hang out the open for business sign and really kind of do that in a mature way. So there's a real development process that happens there. So yes, there are folks, plenty of folks, and I've met some very, very good teachers who wear none of this. And it doesn't mean they're not very, very good teachers and very mature practitioners. The way they represent themselves is a choice they've made, right? So we can harmonize that by saying the robe is not visible. We're all wearing the dharma. If you come to practice in the morning, every morning, we chant a verse before we put the robe on. If you don't have a robe, you're not exempted from the chant. If you don't have a rakusu, and maybe you'll never have one, or you don't have an okesa, and maybe you'll never have one, it doesn't mean you don't join with the community in saying, wearing Tathagata's teachings, I free all beings, right? We're all wearing that robe, whether we can see it or not. So there is commonality there. We're in a Zendo practicing together. There is commonality there. So this is a practical dharma in certain ways. And as we know, this is not separate from dharma. So we can wear this sort of non-physical robe and practice in the way that we think is appropriate for us to practice, and we all get to negotiate that. So I think it's a complex question. It's not one I'm going to answer in 2 minutes here because it's a complicated question. But yes, I have colleagues all over the world doing and wearing the things they feel are appropriate, and bless them. Want to follow up or anything there? Other things in the room about Nyoho, things this year? Please.
Just maybe a kind of related question or thought. I think, for me, one of the things that inspired me to Buddhist practice is like the idea of renunciation. And I think that Nyoho has a lot to do with that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think when I became a priest, I struggled with like clothing, questions of clothing, and sort of precisely what you were just talking about, like, can we somehow be more accessible if we're dressed normally versus like this? And, when I think about it from the frame of renunciation, of course, our sort of like some aspect of our greed wants to look normal and wants to, dress in the way that we want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us modern people, like kind of, wearing this is uncomfortable, especially out in public. And I think that for me now, it's kind of become, I've been trying to sort of wear dharma clothes more often, especially after being in Japan, where it's a little easier because people can kind of know what it means. And here, people don't. But, to the extent that I've done it, like you said, like people have come up to me and been like, oh, you're often it's like, oh, do you do some kind of like martial arts?
You do that chop sake stuff? No.
Yeah, but it often leads into, no, I'm a Buddhist, and they're like, oh wow, that's interesting, and then a conversation starts.
Yeah.
So I would echo the open for business aspect.
Yeah.
But I wonder too, maybe I think you hinted at it repeatedly throughout the talk, but like Nyoho and renunciation, how do you see those two working together?
So I think that's a really interesting intersection because we so want to fall into the pitfall of what we think that means. I mean, your stories are a prime example of that. Like, what does that mean? And especially for women, this is a huge thing. I mean, so we're not used to having no hair. Hair is a big part of as women, big part of our look, right? So to go out like this is an interesting practice. The first time I got a driver's license, oh my gosh, I had to say on the driver's license that this was my permanent look. And they have to ask you, and of course the very nice ladies are very sympathetic until they see you have eyebrows, because they think you're in chemo. And then they see you've got eyebrows, no, that's not it. What's she doing? Is she a radical? Like, what's going on? And I have to proudly say, I look like this all the time. Yes, please take my picture and write that on my driver's license. This is who I am now, right? So for women, I think it's really interesting. For men, I think where you struggle is now you have to wear skirts. And many of you are not used to managing skirts, right? It can be a challenge. So there are these ideas I think we have like that. But renunciation, I think it's so easy to fall off the middle way and say, the only good practitioner is the practitioner who literally owns nothing but the robe, the bowl, the zagu. I can't ever buy anything. I can't have nice things. If someone gives me something, I have to say no. Well, we know that's not the practice. If someone gives you something, especially in the form of support, you have to accept it because that's that person's practice, right? To give to you. I don't know so I can't speak for everyone. I know I struggled with exactly the same things, and that was even before I ordained, because I was thrashing around trying to figure out, what does lay practice look like? I'm reading all these things that are about monks in temples, and I'm reading all of and of course I couldn't, because I was a beginner, I couldn't sort out like this was this sect and this was this sect at different times of Vinaya, oh my gosh, you couldn't sleep on a high bed and you couldn't have a counterpane and you couldn't have like oh my gosh, and then slowly I started to realize, well that was that. And there's a teaching there, there's a core teaching there which is important about attachment, but manifestation is a really challenging thing, right? There is no one good answer. You can't look at a list of things and say, I'm not allowed to own these 250 things. It doesn't work like that, right? It really has to come from here. So on the one side, we can in our very well-meaning attempt to be virtuous, we can go so far the other way, which is so much about our ego, and our families start to worry about us, right? Or we can really go the other way and say, I need to have the best things for my practice because those things are offerings to Buddha. We need to buy the most expensive flowers because those things are offerings to Buddha. Well, wait a minute. Buddha doesn't care. Buddha cares about your sincerity. Buddha doesn't care about, It's a really I don't think we're ever done with that negotiation because I think it's moment by moment. And I think it's really interesting how things shift when we move from lay practice to novice practice to transmitted teacher practice to running a temple practice. I mean, all those, we get to like renegotiate it all the time. What do I own? And what does that mean? Like, I can't, because we know we have things maybe for a while in this life, and because of impermanence, those things are going to go on. So someone's going to own this after me, or it's going to break and fall apart, right? Or my cat's died on Christmas Eve, so I'm really dealing with impermanence. Did I own that cat? I don't know. It's an interesting question, right? So, renunciation, because we can think, well, there are things we just shouldn't ever get mixed up in. Is that the Bodhisattva way? Or do we sometimes need to be Jizo going into hell, into places where it's a questionable circumstance, and yet there's liberating beings to be done, right? We can create a lot of separation around that. So anyway, I think what you're raising is really interesting. It's not a quick answer, as we know. There's a lot of discernment that goes with that. So I think but I do think we have to, just to wrap that up, I do think we have to be careful about not reading Nyoho teachings as being, we need to reject things. We need to not own things, or we need to somehow create separation. It's, we have to invite it all in and sort it out, right? There's nothing outside the Buddha way. What would others, that's too much for me. What would others like to say in the room before we go to people at home? Reflections, comments, questions? Are you...
Early on you said, you made a distinction when Buddhism was being transmitted from China to Japan. There was the dharma, the teachings, and then there was the container. So you differentiated those two.
Temporarily, provisionally.
Provisionally, okay.
Let's say provisionally.
So I was thinking the other day, one of the books I really love reading is How the Swans Came.
Yes.
Yes, it's a great book. And Zen seems to be that form of Buddhism which seems to have best adapted to the American landscape for a number of reasons. One of which I think is that we have 16 precepts. There's a greater flexibility because people in China, monks there wouldn't regard us as monks because we don't follow all those precepts.
Right.
But if that was the requirement for bringing Buddhism to America, I don't think it would take hold.
Well, it would have taken hold differently.
But
We
invented the idea of Zen centers. That's something that isn't in Asia.
Oh, absolutely.
So we have a different container, a different way of approaching it, a different way of adapting it to the particular cultural landscape in which we are functioning.
Right. So
discuss that some.
Oh, well, how long have you got? That was my master's thesis.
We'll give it an abstract then.
Well, I mean, so as you know, as soon as the master's thesis hits paper, it's out of date. So I've moved on in the many years. So that is a huge conversation, which is never done. I would just say, Nyoho is inviting us again to sit in this intersection between what we've inherited from our ancestors and what we need to carry, how we need to carry that forward in this moment. And I think there's a lot of creativity there. I can't tell you how many times I've heard Toto-san say, we need to be creative and flexible because we're in a different culture, in a different time, in a different place than Dogen was 800 years ago, than Buddha was 2,600 years ago. So our challenge, and if you look at our sort of 6 points of practice, one of the things in there is we know what we're doing and why, and it means we understand the through line from Buddha, through the ancestors, through the Mahayana, to Dogen, down through our 20th century ancestors to us. That through line is important, but practice is going to manifest differently as things move across time and space, right? So we just know that. So our challenge here is to be very sincere and wholehearted, and one of the reasons I want next year to look at the world of Soto Zen is to put what we're doing in context so again we understand why. So when we're carrying things forward, does this look like a training temple? Well, Doju can tell you no. And I can tell you no. we have to adapt because we're not in those circumstances, and yet the spirit has to stay alive, right? Buddha is alive because we're practicing. How do we keep Buddha alive? Let's not cast off Buddha's hands and arms and feet sort of randomly, right? And at the same time, if we know what our ancestors were handing us, I think that's helpful. So I wanted to start in 2024 with our 20th century ancestors because those are the three sets of teachings that are closest to us in time and space. Because we hear all the time when we read Sawaki Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi, the things that they're confronting and the things that they're working with feel very contemporary to us. Suez Canal wasn't all that long ago, right? What Uchiyama Roshi is dealing with post-World War II is not all that long ago. And what Toto-san, the things that he has learned and carries in his body and brings into the Zendo are very, very current and relevant. So we get to see, I want to start there. What does that intersection look like? And then let's back up, and then let's back up. So now, World of Soto Zen, we're going to expand that quite a lot. So that's an ongoing story. I'm going to say that's a wonderful segue into 2026. Thank you for that.
So you're going to answer the question over the next year.
Not me personally. I think we as a community are going to have a lot of really interesting discussions about how we go forward and why we go forward in the way that we do. And, things were not predetermined. It didn't have to be this way. So we need to understand some of what those forces are, because that's what helps us look forward. Like, how do we carry this practice in a really meaningful, sincere, what's the word I want? With integrity. How do we do this with integrity, right? How do we not fall apart? So, you're opening the door for 2026. Right? So, keep us on task. Bring up things during the year so we can stay on task. Other things in the room today. Please, Owen.
I'm interested in what you're talking about kind of character development, how that intersects with Nyoho. So I was talking to Sawyer about this just like maybe a month ago, actually. I've been very interested recently in a way of thinking about personality. Thinks categorically, but then also dimensionally, and especially in terms of like rigidity. You might be predisposed or predilected towards being in some sort of way, but like how rigid is that, right? It's a very interesting way of thinking. Since we've been talking about Nyoho, I've been working on parsimony, which in terms of rigidity, I think I've gotten a little bit better at. I don't think that I'm ever going to be as like parsimonious as someone like Hoshin, right? Like I just don't think that that's the kind of category I'm in.
So for the benefit of folks in the room, how are you defining parsimony?
Directness, clarity.
Directness and clarity, okay.
Brevity probably as well. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, which you see I'm not being. I wonder what you think about, that kind of two different axes, I guess, of personality, and how that might be relevant to Nyoho, because, maybe being a very parsimonious, unassuming person is most Nyoho, but maybe this person just isn't so much that, yeah?
Well, I think we have to be careful about labeling, because I don't know what's going on in somebody's heart and mind, right? So, can there be disconnect between what's going on in here and what I'm manifesting outwardly? Certainly. And I think so we can't practice for other people. What other people do, they're going to do. What we can do is say, how am I going to harmonize what's going on in here and what I'm manifesting outwardly? And that in itself is a lifelong practice, right? Because what we're manifesting has so much to do with how do I want someone to understand me, or how do I want someone to think of me? What good impression do I want to create? So can we let go of the I've always thought one of the most compassionate things we can do is to give up an opportunity for sort of self-aggrandizement. And most of the time when we give up that opportunity, nobody knows we're doing it. And the reason is because we didn't do something. If you give up the opportunity to humble brag, if you give up the opportunity to put yourself forward, nobody knows you're not doing that. You see that opportunity, but probably nobody else does. Oh, I could talk about how I did this thing, right? You give up that opportunity, it's really, really quiet. Because nobody knows you've given up something which you think is like really precious. What a great practice. Can you give up the opportunity for self-aggrandizement? So, I'm not sure how to answer your question, I'll just say, other than to say, I think that practice of cultivating the character and seeing how that manifests outwardly, and also cultivating deportment and seeing what that does for us in here is a really useful thing, because in our culture we tend to want to say, express yourself, do what you want, you shouldn't be locked down by systems or expectations or sort of what's the word, rules and forms, and people kind of have a real unhappy reaction to that. If you're in that circumstance, though, where your aspiration is to be interchangeable with everybody else in the Zendo, when it comes to like a ceremony or something, one of the first things I was taught is that everyone should be interchangeable, right? This is not about you. So you should be able to step into somebody's role and like nobody should know the difference, and everybody knows what's happening, and everyone's moving the same way, has the same deportment, right? There's something really interesting about that, what it does to you internally. And it's not about feeling oppressed and repressed and rigid, right? There's something really liberating in that. I remember hearing years ago, long before I was a doshi, somebody saying, oh, well, when you're a doshi, you should be expressing your whatever. And I had another peer say to me, absolutely not. This is not about you. You are carrying something on behalf of the community, right? So your deportment here is not about what's happening here. And yet, I have old sore knees. I don't bow very well anymore, right? I mean, So there's the particulars, as we were saying, there's the particulars, and then there's going beyond the particulars. So what sits in that intersection, I think, is a lifelong investigation. That's one aspect of it. I think there's lots of aspects of it, right? So I'm not going to fully answer your question. Because I think that's something, there's some discernment there, yeah, for everybody. But I will say, I can't do discernment for someone else, so all we can work on is this. Other questions, reflections in the room before we go to the folks at home? Sawyer, I'm going to ask you to help me manage. Folks at home, do you have things you'd like to add to the conversation? Comments, questions, reflections, pearls of wisdom? Ado.
Well, this has been a very interesting year. This has clarified a lot of things for me, and a lot of these ideas I had before, but they weren't. They didn't have a context. So, for instance, in my 30s, and I went to a Catholic monastery, and I had. What I want to say is, you talked about attitude, so I would add to that, like, what is our motivation for what the choice we're making, which is part of our attitude. So I was in a long stage of self-denial. That was the thing to do. And it was about my own self-image and also how I wanted people to see me. I mean, and so the question of, well, so for an example, before I went to the Catholic monastery, I was in my 30s and I had long hair, and I talked to my spiritual director about, I said, I think I should cut my hair, even though it's not required at this stage. And because this long, beautiful hair didn't fit my image of what this aesthetic person should be. It was too pretty. And he said, well, go ahead and cut it if you must, but consider, will you be any less attached to that than you are to your current hair? In other words, were you going to be attached to not having hair? I mean, and another interesting thing is, he's a Christian, so he said, and another thing to consider is that your hair gives glory to God. And so part of, I've been through a lot of stages of this, and one of them was during that self-denial, I couldn't allow myself to do a lot of things. And I mean, like, almost like I was not allowed to enjoy things. I was not allowed to be pretty. I mean, or wear, I had to wear dull colors all the time. And that was like an image. And also, you could say, well, maybe I actually did want to be conspicuous. I mean, by being different in that way. And so that, everything is kind of like a middle way. And part of what happened to me is after some years of that, I kind of realized some things like, well, actually, you can have some things without being attached to them. Not being attached doesn't mean you don't have anything. And I started to let myself enjoy some things like color. Um, Now, I'm all for the formal clothes and the Zendo, but otherwise, I started sort of, you might say, practicing joy, um, and which was just the opposite of what I had been doing before. And not only joy for me, but for other people. Um, so it's kind of like, why are you doing something? So I started wearing like more colorful things and stuff like that, and kind of it was more like celebrating life, and sharing that celebration with other people, and seeing myself as somebody who is here to bring joy to other people, not just to deny myself everything. And anyway, it's an ongoing discernment, I think, where the middle way is, because we have all kinds of weird motivations for things we do or don't do. And it helps to have that ongoing question, like what is it I'm doing? Why am I doing it? Is there attachment or isn't there? It's an ongoing discernment almost with everything we do. But it was important for me to learn that that didn't take a particular um, shape or form that was dictated by something outside of me. And that was that was a good change for me.
Yeah, yeah. What an important path of learning there, right? So I think Ada's making an interesting distinction between owning something and being attached to something, right? We can own things without being attached to them. That's not an automatic, right? That's a useful thing. Yeah. And now, we all know Ada brings joy everywhere she goes, so I'm glad you've turned that down. People love her laugh. I've had more people say, I always know when Ada's in the building. I love the laugh. I can hear Ada laughing. So good for you. Good.
So with the nuns, there was also this question in the late 70s and 80s, how to dress in public.
Yeah.
And there was a broad range of views about that. Some people felt that if they wore their veil or their habit, that it told people that they were available to them. The other people had an opposite feeling about that. That it was put off. It separated you from other people. It put you off as kind of like a virtuous person that no one's going to want to approach you because you're abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
And none of it was untrue. But I mean, it was just interesting. It was the same kind of discernment, trying to, what am I going to look like? What does that mean? Why am I looking this way?
Yep. Well, that's why I say we're not the only ones struggling with this. I mean, when you look at what the full, nuns habit, that's a medieval costume, just like this is a medieval costume, right?
Right.
I mean, that was, secular clothing how many thousand years ago? So it's really interesting. Vestments is a whole interesting thing, which we can get into next year. Good. Thank you for that, Ado, because I know you had personal experience with all that stuff, so thank you for sort of letting us into that. Other comments, questions from folks at home? And I'm going to ask Sawyer to kind of help me see.
There's Abby.
Abby, okay.
Yes, a little embarrassed right now by the rather fiery color of my lining.
Well, that's good.
I'm just joking.
Hey, you're about to be under the bomb cyclone. You need to be wearing all the clothes you've got.
That's right. No, just kidding around about that. But I just want to. This is more about gratitude for this year in Nyoho. I can't tell you how much it's meant to me as a layperson because I see it in every decision I make. And it's a wonderful guidance. And above all, I see Sanshin as involved in a most interesting experiment in maintaining and tending to the spirit while not neglecting the form. And I know how difficult that is. I mean, the history is littered with rigidification. And this is the most important experiment of all. Anyway, thank you.
Well, that's lovely, Abby. Thank you. I'm so glad you've been able to practice with us. from Connecticut. And although you're not physically in our Zendo, my goodness, you're here 6 days a week. So I'm glad this has been meaningful for you. I was a little bit concerned in the beginning of 2025 that this was going to feel a little bit self-serving because this is something I'm personally interested in. So I'm glad it's been useful for others in the Sangha as well. So as I say, I hope the conversation is not over. Let's find more ways to enter into those gateways. So, and I'm glad it's been useful for lay practice. I think we can get so caught up in trying to be monks, right? Which is not any of our lives at this moment right here. So, how do we practice outside of that model, that image, as another piece of ongoing discernment? Other
Can I respond to her a little bit?
Sure, please.
It's about gratitude and the importance of gratitude. And I think that's part of what my evolution was, realizing that, well, in my self-denial, I wasn't being grateful and I wasn't appreciating things. And when I started learning that I could do that, it was like, wow, that's really nice. I can be grateful for that. I can celebrate that. I can be happy and joyous about that instead of saying, I can't have that. I mean, and sort of savor it, whatever it is, and appreciate it. I can appreciate it and not just deny it. Anyway, I think gratitude is really an important part of it.
Sure, and I think by our own gratitude, we sort of spread that to other people, right? If you're enjoying something and grateful for something, it's a wonderful model of practice. We can all be grateful and enjoy, right? There's nothing that says we can't do that. Can we do that without attachment? Certainly. Other comments, questions, reflections from people at home? Any last words for us today? Everyone doing okay? All right. This feels like a really positive, helpful, interesting note to end our year on, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So next Sunday, when we get together, we will hear from Toto-san, and we will be off to a new year of practice. Thank you, everybody, for your practice this year. Please continue to join us, be part of our community next year. We are going to do some really interesting things and have some really interesting conversations. So I look forward to all of that with all of you. Thank you, everybody.